Welcome to the Justification podcast. Today we are discussing the philosophy of nihilism, which is the belief that life is without intrinsic value, meaning, or purpose. One day we are born onto this planet, and one day we will die. We know and understand what happens in between, but we don't know what happens before or after. This has allowed the question, what is the meaning of life, to plague humanity ever since we became sentient. If we don't know where we came from and where we are going, then how can we tell that our present actions right now have any significance at all? Ever since we became sentient, we have not been able to objectively answer what is the meaning of life as a species. Sure, we can survive and procreate, but to what extent? What are we surviving for? Life is like being thrown into a test you weren't aware you are going to take. And nihilism is the understanding that you don't have to answer these questions, nor feel the need to answer them. To subdue the pain of not knowing why we are here, many people have tried to give meaning to life. They had different answers. Some people believe that we are created by a god, and that whatever we do on this earth in our lifetime is going to determine our afterlife. Others believe that life is an experience to be had rather than something that must possess meaning. Some others live to find out things, learn, become able to do things that they would like to do. They live because others want them to, and they want them to live along with them. They live because they have hope and want to see what happens next. However, for nihilists, life is meaningless. All actions, suffering, emotions, and achievements have no meaning at all. In the end, nothing you ever do will be remembered. There is no reason for you to do anything. You could die a king or you could die a peasant. Nobody is going to remember you. Some might argue that there are people who lived ages ago and are still remembered to this day. Of course, some people are remembered long after they're gone for things that currently seem important and useful. Even then, if one is remembered only because they've done something useful, isn't it the useful thing that is being remembered and not the person? I mean, how does anyone know Albert Einstein if not in terms of scientific contributions? It's not like the world inherently likes him, they like his contributions. Or they like him because of his contributions. Being remembered sounds cool and motivational until you remember that in 100 years, you are certainly going to be forgotten, and you won't be remembered for you but for your contributions. In 100 years, the 20th century will be but a strange section of human history, often reflected upon by people who don't relate to it in any meaningful way. Therefore, even if you are remembered, which you won't be, but for the sake of this example, let's assume that you are going to be remembered, you won't be there for it. You won't be there to experience it. You won't even know whether it happened or not. People will know your name and what you did, but it will take them about, say, 10 to 15 minutes to forget about you and move on to the next thing. We have all been faced with nihilistic thoughts, when it suddenly hits you the purposelessness of everything going on and how everyone just seems to not realize it either intentionally or unintentionally. I've personally experienced it myself. When I look around me and I see all of these people, just some driving to work, others caught up with like very minuscule things, like why? And they appear to be living in ignorant bliss. If you keep asking why this, why that, where did this come from, who did it come from, you'll eventually arrive at nothing. And nihilists at this point, they arrive at the conclusion that life is just meaningless. There is no higher purpose for their existence, and everyone could care less whether they lived or died. The word nihilism comes from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing, and ism, which refers to an ideology. So it is an ideology of nothingness. It also appears in the verb annihilate, meaning to bring to nothing, to destroy completely. Now you might be thinking, whoa, these people are just pessimists. But that is where you would be wrong. Nihilism is very easily confused with pessimism. Okay. Pessimists always believe in the worst outcome. They believe that the worst outcome is always going to occur. In the end, evil always defeats good. However, pessimists believe that there is good out there, but humans are incapable of achieving that good. Unlike nihilists who believe that there is nothing out there. There is no good, there is no evil. No one wins everything. It is all meaningless and doesn't matter. It is commonly also confused with cynicism, where cynics believe that human beings are basically motivated by greed and self-interest. They are distrustful of others and usually very negative. This idea suggests that humans are not good. It means there is good out there, just not in humans. In the mind of the nihilist, good and evil don't exist. Nothing does. Nihilism hasn't been created at a set period of time. It has existed in one form or another for hundreds of thousands of years. We as humans have been aware of the pointlessness of our existence ever since we became sentient. Nothing matters, and we will be forgotten. Early in the 19th century, Friedrich Jacobi used the word to negatively characterize transcendental idealism, which is the claim that all empirical objects in space and time, are mind-dependent, and that we cannot cognize the mind-independent world. It only became popularized, however, after its appearance in Ivan Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons in 1982. In Russia, nihilism became identified with a loosely organized revolutionary movement that rejected the authority of the state, church, and family. In his early writing, anarchist leader Michael Bakunin composed the notorious entreaty still identified with nihilism, which states, "Let us put our trust in the eternal spirit which destroys and annihilates only, because it is the unsearchable and eternally creative source of all life. The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." By rejecting man's spiritual essence in favor of a solely materialistic one, nihilists denounced God and religious authority as directly opposed to freedom. The movement eventually deteriorated into an ethos of subversion, destruction, and anarchy, and by the late 1870s, a nihilist was anyone associated with the clandestine political groups advocating terrorism and assassination. In the early days of nihilism, becoming more and more known, did not start off as a philosophy, but as a word in a novel, then a political movement, then it slowly made its way into becoming a philosophy. The earliest philosophical positions associated with what could be characterized as a nihilistic outlook are those of the skeptics. Now, skepticism denies the possibility of certainty. Skeptics denounce traditional truths as unjustifiable opinions. With Demosthenes, for example, observed, "What he wished to believe, that is what each man believes." He posits the relational nature of knowledge. Extreme skepticism, then, is linked to epistemological nihilism, which denies the possibility of knowledge and truth. This form of nihilism is currently identified with postmodern anti-foundationalism, where an anti-foundationalist is one who does not believe that there is some fundamental belief or principle which is the basic ground or foundation of inquiry and knowledge. Nihilism, in fact, can be understood in several different ways. Political nihilism, as noted, is associated with the belief that the destruction of all existing politic, social, and religious order is a prerequisite for any future improvement. There are many types of nihilism, and we are going to be discussing each type. The first type of nihilism is political nihilism, the one that I've briefly mentioned, is the position holding no political goals whatsoever, except for the complete destruction of all existing political institutions, along with the principles, values, and social institutions that uphold them. Political nihilists believe that for humanity to move forward as a species, all political, social, and religious orders must be destroyed for a man to be truly free to do literally whatever he desires, whatever he wants. With this type of nihilism, good and bad is a mere concept created by society and it doesn't actually exist. One shouldn't follow these morals placed by societies if one wants to achieve absolute individual freedom. Okay, so the way I see it is you are born into this world. It is absurd. You don't know why you're here, you don't know how you got here, you're just here. Everyone you know and everyone you love, including you, is going to die. In 100 years, you are going to be forgotten. So why chain yourself to the good and bad defined by others? Nothing is to say that doing bad things is bad or that doing good things is good. They are just concepts. If you want to attain absolute total freedom over your own life, you mustn't follow anything created by society and do whatever you want. Then there's existential nihilism, the philosophical theory that life has no intrinsic meaning or value with respect to the universe. Existential nihilism suggests that a single human, or even the entire human species as a whole, is insignificant, without purpose, and unlikely to change in the totality of existence. I urge you to close your eyes and fully take in the absurdity of what I am about to say. You are an evolved monkey on a huge red rock that's floating around a giant ball of fire in the inconceivable vastness of a dark universe, in a galaxy that is ultimately very tiny and unnoticeable and destined to die anyways. It is very unlikely that your existence has any meaning at all or is going to change anything. But that's okay in the mind of the existential nihilist because nothing matters anyways. We are here to die. Do you see just how the existentialism and nihilism connect? That last part, that nothing matters anyways, is what differentiates the existential nihilist from just the existentialist. According to the theory, each individual is an isolated being born into the universe, barred from knowing why. In his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "What do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man, first of all, exists. He encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterward. If a man, as the existentialist, sees himself as not definable, it is because, to begin with, he is nothing. He will not be anything until later. Then he will be what he makes of himself." According to Donald A. Crosby, an American theologist, there is no justification for life, but also no reason not to live. Those who claim to find meaning in their lives are either dishonest or deluded. In either case, they fail to face up to the harsh reality of the human situation. In his study of meaninglessness, Donald Crosby writes that the source of modern nihilism, paradoxically, stems from the commitment to honest intellectual openness. Once set in motion, the process of questioning could come to but one end: the erosion of conviction and certitude and collapse into despair. Then you have cosmic nihilism, which is actually my favorite one, and it is close to existential nihilism. I know, surprising given that they're two types of the same concept, but cosmic nihilism states that the position that reality or the cosmos is either wholly or significantly unintelligible, that it provides no foundation for human aims and principles. Particularly, it may regard the cosmos as distinctly hostile or indifferent to humanity. Now, that was a mouthful of fancy words, but what I am trying to say here is that the cosmos, the universe, is massive, so unintelligible and incomprehensible that it makes humans insignificant as a whole. Then it intensifies the insignificance of human beings and their accomplishments as a whole. Now, to some of you, that may just sound like cosmicism because, to be fair, the philosophy of cosmicism states that there is no recognizable divine presence such as a god in the universe, and that humans are particularly insignificant in the larger scheme of the intergalactic existence. The most prominent theme is humanity's fear of their insignificance in the face of an incomprehensibly large universe, a fear of the cosmic void. However, as it may sound very similar to, if not cosmic nihilism, one important difference is that cosmicism tends to emphasize the insignificance of humanity and its doings, rather than flat out rejecting the possible existence of some higher purpose. It is not the absence of meaning that causes terror for humans, it is their discovery that they have absolutely no power to change anything in the vast, indifferent universe that surrounds them. Another really interesting type of nihilism is ethical nihilism or moral nihilism, which rejects the possibility of absolute moral or ethical values. Instead, good and evil are nebulous, and values addressing such are the product of nothing more than social and emotive pressures. It is best described with an example where a moral nihilist would say that killing someone for whatever reason is neither inherently right nor inherently wrong. Anyone is free and allowed to do anything they want because good, bad, right, wrong, those don't exist. What's actually interesting about it is that it also plays a part in political nihilism, where one would have to believe in ethical nihilism in order to justify breaking laws and doing morally unjust actions, thus leading to their own individual freedom. Just a disclaimer, I make political nihilism sound like the path to individual freedom, which is not what I'm trying to say. Despite there being some truth in it, don't just go around breaking laws to attain individual freedom because that will land you in jail and you'll have much less freedom than you do now. Last but not least, we have epistemological nihilism. Now, I have saved this one for last because it is probably the most uncomfortable of the bunch. It is the most uncomfortable to me, and I'm sure to many others, because it challenges certainty. People don't like the idea of not having their feet firmly planted on the ground. It's the urge to seek the feeling of being in control, of knowing everything about ourselves and the universe as a whole. Epistemological nihilism is a form of philosophical skepticism, according to which knowledge does not exist, or, if it does exist, it is unattainable for human beings. Everything we know now is limited. It is limited by our subjective interpretation of what's around us, what our five senses allow us to sense. Given that we use less than 10% of our own mental capacity and are still discovering ourselves, our intellectual knowledge is but a small raft in the deep, vast ocean of the unknown. What I'm trying to say here is that all of the knowledge we possess is in context of this little raft, even most of which is subject to constant debate and change, and everyone just starts to see everything from a different perspective and comes up with their own reasons for why it's like this and not that, and that does not help at all. The true knowledge is only relative to the confines of a framework, and even though this framework is the only framework one has reference in, it is a framework nonetheless, and thus the true knowledge is only applicable in these borders. That is exactly why not even true knowledge is true. While writing this part, I had what I believe is a really great way to describe it. Imagine a sheep trapped in between four fences that form a square around it. On the inside of the fences, the grass is green and healthy, so the sheep thinks, I need to eat grass to live. It believes eating grass to live is an absolute truth, because it saw no way that eating grass could kill it. However, on the outside, the grass is poisonous and the sheep have to survive on something else in order to survive. Perhaps there is another thing they should be able to eat or have control over. Outside of these borders of the fence, the established truth that the sheep has becomes deathly untrue. It doesn't need to eat grass to survive anymore, it just needs to find something to eat. In an especially ever-changing world, such absolute truths can be refuted. For example, why can't we create a drink that contains all of our nutritional needs? Wouldn't that just be a substitute for eating as a whole? Can such a drink be created? And if so, what does that say about all the other truths we have established? Doesn't this drink negate the absolute truth that we have established so far, that eating is necessary for survival? If we couldn't get the most basic thing right, the thing that our brains are hardwired to do, which is survive, right, then how do we expect everything else we know to be true? It is simple, we don't. No matter how much we think we know about ourselves, we don't know for certain. Countless discoveries have been theorized and got disproven later on, and who knows what else is out there. In the mind of the epistemological nihilist, he finds no reason to search for meaning in the first place, rightfully so. It'll probably be wrong and built on delusion and false hopes or beliefs more than anything. In other words, searching for the truth is meaningless and ultimately pointless because humans are not capable of attaining such truths. If you actually take it in for what it's worth, it is scary to think about how everything you know right now is not guaranteed to be the truth, the absolute truth we think we have regarding objects or facts we know about ourselves. We barely know how our body operates, and even that we don't know fully. Then what's to say that we are capable of attaining the absolute truth? The answer is, as always, nothing. Nihilists reach this answer a lot, and that reinforces their beliefs and viewpoints. But wouldn't that be contradictory? I personally find it amusing, actually, how the belief in nothing is still a belief in something. You still believe in something, but that something happens to be nothingness, which is paradoxical. There are a lot of layers to nihilism, which is why it's one of my favorite philosophies out there. I am very excited to share two types of nihilists. So you have the active nihilist who, when confronted with the realization that nothing matters, is delighted because that means that he gets the freedom to do whatever he wants. If he fails or embarrasses himself, it won't matter, nobody's going to remember. He can do quite literally anything he wants if he sets his mind to it. He's excited because that means that he gets to decide which path to follow, the one that makes him feel most connected to himself. To the active nihilist, the concept of defining your own purpose, then following that path, is exciting in and of itself. However, finding the meaning of your life is not easy. It requires walking a fine line between rigidity and flexibility. You don't want to change your life's purpose as often as you change clothes, but you also might realize that the path you were planning to follow at 18, for example, isn't fit for you now that you're 28. Plus, when seeking your life's meaning, it can be difficult to know where to start. So, take your time, reflect on your skills, interests, hobbies, things you like, and things you dislike, and give it your best shot because it's your only one. Then you have passive nihilism. The passive nihilist is the individual who, when confronted with the nihilism, the same reality that the active nihilist is confronted with, sees it as an endpoint or a sign to stop the search for meaning. In short, this type of individual lacks the strength to make anything of their life, and unfortunately, many who reach this stage will, as we discussed earlier, out of sheer desperation, attach themselves to some form of mass movement in the final attempt to find an objective purpose to life. The passive nihilist falls into depression upon realizing that their life is a quote-unquote lie. The nothing matters hits them harder than it should, and they give up all hope of becoming anything because it doesn't matter. So what if they pursued their dreams? They won't be remembered, it doesn't matter. Why do anything when the world won't even know you existed? You are destined for nothingness, and no matter what you do, you cannot fight it. The passive nihilist then falls into a depression upon being faced with the fact that life is ultimately meaningless. That is the type of nihilist you want to avoid becoming. The passive nihilist experiences this existential dread and sees it as something horrible when it's really not. This meaninglessness could mean ultimate freedom or it could mean ultimate depression. I cannot emphasize enough how you just don't want to become a passive nihilist. It usually doesn't end well. Instead of falling into depression because of it, try to use it to your advantage and create your own meaning. It's the better option for your sake. In case you find yourself suffering from passive nihilism, Thomas Nagel has an interesting rebuttal to this worry. Okay, so you say nothing we do now will matter in a million years. That implies, conversely, that nothing which happens in a million years matters now. Therefore, it doesn't matter now that nothing will matter in a million years. Just try to get your head around that. Before I go ahead and talk about the father of nihilism, I would really like to quickly brush over something called existential dread. Existential dread refers to the negative feelings experienced by an individual when they begin to question their purpose in the world, the meaning of life, and what comes after death. Existential dread is usually linked to nihilism due to it being seen as a response or consequence of engagement to questions about the meaning of life. That said, you do not have to be a nihilist to experience it. Should this existential dread intensify, it can lead to something called existential crisis or existential anxiety. For existentialists, an existential crisis is considered necessary, complex journey of awareness and growth. However, for those not intending to start the journey, it can arise surprisingly during periods of instability and cause mental health problems. While there are no specific treatment options for people experiencing an existential crisis, there are options available to help with some of the symptoms, such as medications, antidepressants in particular, or cognitive behavioral therapy, otherwise known as CBT, self-care activities, and mindfulness. Now, this episode wouldn't be complete without talking about the father of nihilism, Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most influential figures in the nihilistic viewpoint and is often regarded as the father of nihilism. Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844. His father was a Lutheran pastor, which would immerse young Nietzsche into Christianity. However, his views would be challenged as the same man who practiced and preached of God was diagnosed with a terminal brain disease. His father suffered horribly, then died, and things wouldn't get better for young Nietzsche as 1 year later his brother would die. This exposure of reasonless pain and suffering experienced by good, undeserving people would likely lay the groundwork for most of Nietzsche's work. Nietzsche had a brilliant school and university career, showing great intellectual potential. He studied theology at the University of Bonn, and he would especially excel in Christian theology. However, after being confronted with countless critiques of Christianity, he saw himself as no longer able to blindly devote himself to it. He would make the decision to study philology, which is the study of ancient language at the University of Leipzig. He would do so well there that he would be hired as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, being the youngest professor to have been hired to this day. A few years later, he would quit teaching as a result of his poor mental health at the time and would travel very often to climates that best suited his mental health at the time. Most notably, he would travel to the Swiss Alps where he would spend the majority of his sane life. He lived a very isolated life, constantly being either bedridden by his illnesses, a broken heart after being rejected by his crush, and soon after, he would start to see his friendships and family relations degrade into nothing. Being in such a depressive and nihilistic state, he would go on walks, think, find solace, meaning, and reason for existence as a whole. Nietzsche produced a lot of literary work, and I will be going over his most relevant work in detail. In 1878, he would complete Human All Too Human, and then went on to make a second part, Mixed Opinions and Maxims, and the third part, The Wanderer and His Shadow, in 1880. The three parts were published together in 1886 as Human All Too Human. These works were composed into a series of several hundred short passages and aphorisms, concise condensations of his assorted insights whose typical length ranges from a line or two to a page or two. Here, he often reflects upon cultural and psychological phenomena by connecting them to individuals' organic and psychological constitutions. He tends at this time to invoke hedonistic considerations of pleasure and pain in his explanation of cultural and psychological phenomena. Given his harsh criticisms of hedonism and utilitarianism in later works, Human All Too Human appears to many readers as uncharacteristic work, more science than art-inspired in its approach to health, presupposing fundamentally hedonistic moral psychology, and does not fully embody the pain and power-centered approach that he later developed. In the year 1883, Nietzsche would start writing a book named Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which would end up being one of Nietzsche's most famous works, and one he regarded as his most significant. It is a manifesto of personal self-overcoming and a guidebook towards the same revitalizing end. It would be so inspirational and life-changing that during World War One, 30 years after its publication, 150,000 copies of the work were printed by the German government and issued as inspirational reading to young soldiers, along with the Bible. Nietzsche also filled the work with nature metaphors almost in the spirit of the pre-Socratic naturalist philosophy, which invokes animals, earth, air, fire, water, celestial bodies, and plants, all in the service of describing the spiritual development of Zarathustra, a solitary, reflective, exceedingly strong-willed, sage-like, laughing and dancing voice of heroic self-mastery who, accompanied by a proud, sharp-eyed eagle and a wise snake, envisions a mode of a psychologically healthier being, beyond the common human condition. Nietzsche refers to this higher mode of being as superhuman, and associates the doctrine of eternal recurrence, a doctrine only for the healthiest who can love life in its entirety. With this spiritual standpoint, all too commonly human attitudes stand as a mere bridge to be crossed and overcome. In 1886, Nietzsche would work on a book called Beyond Good and Evil. The main purpose of this book is to deliver the point that we should not settle for what philosophers and religions tell us about morals, truth, values, but to go even further beyond. It is arguably a rethinking of human or to human, since the respective tables of contents and sequence of themes loosely correspond to one another. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche identifies imagination, self-assertion, danger, originality, and the creation of values as qualities of genuine philosophers as opposed to mere scholars engaged in positive research in the science and humanities, or the dusty classification of philosophical outlooks. Nietzsche takes aim at some of the world's great philosophers who ground their outlooks wholeheartedly upon concepts such as self-consciousness and free will and either-or bipolar thinking. As he views things from the perspective of life, Nietzsche denies that there is a universal morality applicable indiscriminately to all human beings, and instead designates a series of moralities in an order of rank that ascends from the plebeian to the noble. Some moralities are more suitable for subordinate roles, and some are more appropriate for dominating and leading social roles. What counts as a preferable and legitimate action depends upon the kind of person one is. The deciding factor is whether one is weaker, sicker, and on the decline, or whether one is healthier, more powerful, and overflowing with life. In 1882, Nietzsche would write what would end up becoming one of his most notable pieces of literature, The Gay Science. Nietzsche sets forth some of the existential ideas for which he became famous, namely the proclamation that God is dead and the doctrine of eternal recurrence, a doctrine that attends to how people of different levels of health are likely to react to the prospect of being reborn over and over again, to replay life's experiences exactly as before in every pleasurable and painful sequence of detail. Nietzsche's atheism, his account of God's murder, expresses in a literary manner his philosophical condemnation of all absolute perspectives and values. His atheism also aims to redirect people's attention to their inherent freedom, the presently existing world, and away from the escapist, pain-relieving, and heavenly other worlds. In 1901, Nietzsche would write The Will to Power. The will to power is the first force that makes events happen. It is the internal will, which creates the need for a force to act. In this sense, it is the will which dictates what the force should do. The will to power describes what Nietzsche may have believed to be the main driving force in humans. However, the concept was never systematically defined in Nietzsche's work, leaving its interpretation up for debate. Usage of the term by Nietzsche can be summarized as self-determination, the concept of actualizing one's will onto one's self or one's surrounding, and coincides heavily with egoism. I would like to discuss something fundamental. If you're not going to take in anything I said earlier, at least take this. It is crucial that we clarify exactly why it is we should care. Why should we spend our time looking into it all? The reason I say that concern is necessary is that the feeling of nihilism will very possibly strike you at some point in life if it hasn't already. Recognizing that all of this going on simply doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things is going to massively aid you in living a life full of tranquility and acceptance of one's self. If you choose to ignore the reality of the absurdity of what's going on, you're going to be submerged into falsity, where you'll be severely overwhelmed by the smallest things that are easily solvable, but your emotions around them are going to be more difficult to solve. Going through life with the nothing really matters in the back of your mind is going to allow you to see everything around you through the lens of amusement. You see everyone overwhelmed by events that they won't be able to recall 5 years later. There seems to be a strange comfort surrounding the concept of nihilism. Nihilism's promise is you don't have to care. Nothing matters anyway. Nothing means anything. So why would you? Nihilism promises evasion of all responsibility. You don't have to do anything because nothing matters. And it promises simplicity, an escape from the worrying complexity of intertwining nebulosity and pattern. Let's take an example. One day you wake up and feel sad, weak, and unmotivated. You do not know why. Let's assume you're not physically ill. At some point, you start to think that your life just doesn't make sense anymore, as you feel detached from your own daily routine, perhaps even from your affections. In a while, you realize that you have adhered for years to certain cultural traits without even questioning them. Consequently, you realize that everything you learned, ranging from language to even beliefs about life, is a human construct which you accidentally fell into just because you were born. Once adults realize this paradox, once they realize that they have access to only a limited, biased version of reality, they experience an unprecedented state of boredom, according to which the world becomes absurd, losing every beauty and strength and any meaning, just grays out. I want you to realize that nihilism is not an endpoint. It is an eye-opener on the status of your self-awareness. The truth is, we live in a paradox. Life is meaningless per se, but humans need meaning to live. Let us try at least to find out our own. As said by Alan Watts, I am what happens between the maternity ward and the crematorium. This is going to mark the end of this week's episode of the Justification podcast. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe on YouTube as well as on Spotify and Apple. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.